My husband called me a net negative on the balance sheet at his company Christmas party. 6 months later, I acquired his struggling investment firm when my hedge fund became the highest performing newcomer on Wall Street. He never knew I'd been building a financial empire right under his nose while he dismissed my Harvard MBA as just a piece of paper. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The crystal glasses clinked throughout Reynolds Financial's annual holiday gala as Boston's financial elite networked beneath the glittering chandeliers of the Seaport Hotel ballroom. I smoothed the fabric of my emerald silk dress, deliberately, chosen to project confidence without seeking attention, while observing the room. In this gathering of investment bankers, hedge fund managers, and financial advisors, anonymity wasn't an option. But neither was making waves. Not yet. Olivia, there you are. Thomas's voice carried that particular tone he reserved for professional gatherings, warm on the surface with an undercurrent of command. My husband of 7 years appeared at my side, champagne flute in hand, his other arm immediately circling my waist in what photographers would capture as affection, but I recognized as possession. "The Coopers were asking about you," he said, steering me toward a couple near the lavish dessert table. "I told them you've been busy organizing our charity foundation's fundraiser next month." I nodded, maintaining the smile I'd perfected. Over the years, the one that reached my eyes just enough to appear genuine without revealing anything authentic behind it. A professional smile, though Thomas would never recognize it as such. Daniel Cooper, CEO of Eastwood Ventures, extended his hand as we approached. "Olivia, wonderful to see you again. Your husband's been telling us about Reynolds Financial's expansion plans, ambitious move into algorithmic trading models. Daniel and I were just discussing the capital requirements," Thomas interjected before I could respond. "The kind of conversation that would make your eyes glaze over, wouldn't it, darling?" He squeezed my shoulder affectionately. To the Coopers, it would look like consideration. Thomas protecting his wife from tedious financial talk. I felt the subtle pressure of his fingers, the unspoken reminder of the role I was expected to play. "Rachel was just telling me about your background before you got married," Daniel's wife said, clearly trying to include me in the conversation. "Harvard Business School, wasn't it? With a concentration in quantitative finance?" A flicker of annoyance crossed Thomas's face, quickly replaced by indulgent amusement. Ancient history now. "Olivia traded financial models for fundraising galas, didn't you, love? Much better suited for her talents." I met Rachel Cooper's gaze briefly, noting the slight furrow in her brow. Unlike her husband, she wasn't smiling at Thomas's dismissal. "I still keep up with market trends," I offered, my voice modulated to sound casual. "Old habits." Thomas laughed, the sound just a touch too loud. "My wife thinks reading the Wall Street Journal means she understands derivatives trading. Adorable, isn't it?" The Coopers' smiles tightened, but Thomas didn't notice. In 7 years of marriage, my husband had developed a remarkable ability to see exactly what he expected to see, and nothing more. And what he expected to see was a decorative wife whose Harvard degree and 4 years at Goldman Sachs were nothing more than an interesting backstory, long since superseded by her more natural role as Mrs. Thomas Reynolds. "If you'll excuse me," I said, maintaining my careful smile, "I should check on the silent auction items. I helped organize the charity component tonight." "Always the perfect hostess," Thomas said proudly, as though my coordination of a fundraiser that would generate over $1. $5 million for financial literacy programs was equivalent to arranging flowers for a dinner party. As I moved through the crowd, I noted Martin Blackwood by the bar, deep in conversation with Sofia Vega. The two controlled significant investment portfolios, and I knew from quarterly reports that both had recently decreased their positions in Reynolds Financial Advisors. What I knew, and Thomas didn't, was that both were also early investors in Meridian Investment Strategies, my investment firm. I caught Martin's eye, and he gave me a nearly imperceptible nod. Tonight wasn't the time. 6 more weeks of careful positioning and everything would be ready. In the relative quiet of the auction display area, I checked my second phone, the one Thomas knew nothing about. 3 messages from Elaine Garrett, my COO. Blackstone financing secured. 85 null orders closed. London team reports arbitrage opportunity exceeding projections by 22%. Moving forward. Call me when you can. Need sign-off on Cooper proposal. I deleted the messages and slipped the phone back into the hidden pocket of my gown. Cooper. Daniel Cooper's firm, Eastwood Ventures, and not coincidentally the primary financing partner. Behind Reynolds Financial's ambitious algorithmic trading platform expansion. The expansion that Thomas had leveraged everything to pursue, convinced it would cement his legacy as a visionary in financial services. What my husband didn't know was that I had spent the last 5 years building relationships with every significant player in his business ecosystem, not as Olivia Reynolds, wife of financial advisor Thomas Reynolds, but as O.P. Hammond, the deliberately low-profile founder of Meridian Investment Strategies, a firm that had strategically developed quantitative investment models that consistently outperformed market indices by remarkable margins. I'd chosen the name Meridian deliberately, the invisible line that separates east from west, marking a position that can only be calculated, never seen. It seemed fitting. There you are. I turned to find Jessica Bennett, my executive assistant, at Meridian, and officially my charity event coordinator as far as Thomas knew. The Coopers are looking for you, she said quietly. Mrs. Cooper specifically. She asked if you had time for a private word. Interesting. Rachel Cooper rarely sought me out at these events. As the wife of Thomas's primary investor, she typically followed the same unwritten rules that governed all the financial wives. Focus on social niceties, avoid serious business discussions, and never, ever outshine your husband. Tell her I'll meet her in the garden terrace in 5 minutes, I replied. Jessica nodded and disappeared into the crowd with the efficient grace that made her invaluable. On paper, she coordinated my social calendar and charity work. In reality, she functioned as my chief of staff at Meridian, handling everything from investor relations to crisis management with equal skill. I made my way to the garden terrace, a smaller space off the main ballroom where strategically placed plants and decorative screens created conversation nooks. Rachel was already there, 2 glasses of sparkling water on the table before her. Olivia, she said, rising to greet me. Thank you for making time. Of course, I replied, taking the seat opposite her. Is everything all right? Rachel glanced around to ensure we were truly private before leaning forward. I thought you should know that Daniel is concerned about Thomas's expansion strategy. The algorithmic models aren't performing as projected, and the tech infrastructure costs are running significantly over budget. I kept my expression neutral, despite the confirmation of what my own analysts had already discovered. I'm sure Thomas has contingency plans in place. That's just it, Rachel said, her voice lowered further. Daniel doesn't think he does. When questioned, Thomas becomes defensive, insists everything is on track. She hesitated. Daniel has always believed in Thomas's vision, but the board is asking questions he can't answer. Why are you telling me this? I asked, though I had my suspicions. Rachel held my gaze. Because unlike your husband, I remember exactly who you were before you became Mrs. Reynolds. Harvard's top quantitative finance graduate. The analyst who developed the multivariate risk assessment model that protected Goldman clients during the last market correction. I said nothing, waiting, and Rachel continued. Because I've been watching Meridian Investment Strategies with great interest. The financial community can't stop talking about their algorithms and extraordinary returns. Fascinating that a company so successful maintains such a low-profile founder, almost as if O.P. Hammond prefers to be underestimated. Our eyes locked in silent understanding. I'd always known Rachel Cooper was observant, but I hadn't realized she'd made the connection. After a moment, I allowed my professional smile to transform into something more genuine. Hypothetically, I said carefully, if someone were building an investment firm in parallel to her husband's while he remained completely unaware, what would you think of that? Rachel's lips curved into a small smile. Hypothetically, I'd think that person must be extraordinarily patient and perhaps married to someone extraordinarily unobservant. Or perhaps, I suggested, married to someone who sees exactly what he expects to see and nothing more. Rachel nodded slowly. Daniel mentioned that Eastwood is considering restructuring their investment in Reynolds Financial given the current concerns. Translation: Eastwood was preparing to pull their financing, which would leave Thomas's expansion plans and possibly his entire company in jeopardy. That would be unfortunate timing with the algorithmic platform midway through development, I observed. Yes, Rachel agreed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Though I understand Meridian has recently secured significant new funding, hypothetically, they might be in a position to acquire distressed financial service providers should any become available in the near future. Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Thomas himself, slightly flushed from what I guessed was his third scotch of the evening. There you are, Olivia. I've been looking everywhere, he said, barely acknowledging Rachel's presence. The Prestons want to discuss hosting their foundation's annual gala with our charity team. I told them you'd handle all the details. He turned to Rachel with a broad smile. My Olivia has a real talent for planning these society events. Never met a woman who could coordinate a guest list and 5-course menu like she can. I rose, smoothly, noting the flicker of dismay on Rachel's face at Thomas's dismissive tone. Rachel and I were just discussing the silent auction, I said. The Literacy Foundation should exceed our target this year. Wonderful, wonderful, Thomas said distractedly. Now, about the Prestons. Actually, Thomas, Rachel interrupted, we were discussing Olivia's insights on the derivatives market. Her analysis of current volatility patterns is quite compelling. Thomas laughed, the sound indulgent and condescending. Oh, Rachel, that's very kind of you to humor her. Olivia likes to think she keeps up with the financial world, but between us, her understanding doesn't extend much beyond checking our investment statements. He placed his hand on my lower back, the pressure slightly firmer than necessary. Isn't that right, darling? Leave the real financial strategy to the professionals. I caught Rachel's eye over his shoulder, seeing in her expression the same thing I felt, the perfect mixture of indignation and opportunity. Because every time Thomas dismissed me, he reinforced his own blindness. And in 6 short weeks, that blindness would cost him everything he'd built. Of course, dear, I said, my professional smile firmly back in place. Whatever you think best. That night's gala proved to be the final public event where Thomas Reynolds confidently proclaimed himself a financial visionary. In the weeks that followed, the algorithmic trading platform began showing critical flaws, returning results that raised red flags with compliance teams and investors alike. What Thomas had promoted as revolutionary predictive analytics turned out to be fundamentally flawed in its approach to market volatility. The expansion costs, already 30% over budget, couldn't be justified when the core technology was proving unreliable in beta testing. And Eastwood Ventures, watching its investment deteriorate in real time, was losing patience. As I sat in Meridian's sleek Cambridge offices finalizing the acquisition strategy, surrounded by the team that had helped me build a $2 billion investment firm in complete secrecy, I felt no triumph. Only a lingering sadness for what might have been if Thomas had ever seen me as a partner rather than an accessory. The Reynolds Financial board meeting is set for Thursday, Elaine reported, sliding the latest financial report across the table. Eastwood is withdrawing all funding effective immediately. The company will need to secure alternate financing within 72 hours to meet pending obligations. I nodded, studying the numbers I already knew by heart. And our offer? Ready to present the moment the Eastwood announcement is made public, Elaine confirmed. We're positioning it as a strategic acquisition to stabilize a valuable but temporarily distressed asset. Which it was. Despite Thomas's mismanagement, Reynolds Financial had excellent client relationships and a solid foundation. Under Meridian's algorithms and risk management protocols, it could thrive again. And the revelation of my identity as O.P. Hammond? I asked. Jessica smiled. PR is ready with statements for all major financial publications. We're positioning it as a strategic decision to operate independently rather than as a direct response to Thomas's dismissal. More professional, less personal, though the financial world would inevitably draw its own conclusions when Thomas Reynolds' supposedly financially illiterate wife was revealed as the mathematical genius behind Wall Street's most talked-about new investment firm. The same wife he'd referred to as a net negative on the balance sheet at last year's Christmas party, laughing with his colleagues about how my charity work cost more than it raised, unaware that I was building a financial juggernaut that would soon acquire his failing company. It's time, I said simply, closing the folder before me. Let's proceed. What happened next would become industry legend. How Thomas Reynolds arrived at the emergency board meeting expecting to discuss emergency, financing options, only to find his wife already seated at the head of the table. How the color drained from his face when Daniel Cooper explained that Meridian Investment Strategies, led by newly revealed CEO Olivia Parker Hammond Reynolds, would be acquiring Reynolds Financial in its entirety. 6 weeks before the acquisition, I sat in the home office of our Beacon Hill brownstone, reviewing quarterly reports that Thomas had left scattered across his desk. Not that he'd asked for my opinion, he never did. But old habits from my Goldman Sachs days made financial analysis as natural as breathing. The reports painted a concerning picture. Reynolds Financial's algorithmic trading platform was showing inconsistent results, with error rates nearly triple what had been projected to investors. Thomas had been working late every night that week, coming home tense and irritable. He claimed it was just the usual end-of-quarter pressure, but these reports told a different story. His flagship project, the one he'd leveraged the company's resources to pursue, was failing, and failing spectacularly. I carefully returned the papers exactly as I'd found them and made my way to our bedroom. Through the bathroom door, I could hear the shower running as Thomas prepared for yet another late-night emergency meeting. No need to tell him I'd seen the reports. He wouldn't value my insights anyway. Instead, I picked up my personal laptop, not the MacBook Air that Thomas had given me for keeping track of your little charity projects, but my high-performance machine with encrypted connections to Meridian's servers. Within moments, I was reviewing our own quarterly performance, which told a very different story. Meridian's quantitative models had outperformed market indices by 22% year-to-date. Our client base had grown by 37% in the same period, primarily through word-of-mouth recommendations from institutional investors impressed by our consistent returns. And our acquisition fund, the one specifically established for opportunities, exactly like what Reynolds Financial was about to become, was fully capitalized and ready to deploy. A notification flashed on my screen. A secure message from Martin Blackwood requesting a meeting tomorrow. As the head of a significant investment group and an early Meridian backer, Martin rarely requested unscheduled meetings unless something important was developing. Still working on your charity spreadsheets? Thomas's voice came from behind me. I smoothly minimized my screens and turned to face my husband, who stood in the doorway in his bathrobe, hair still damp from the shower. Just finalizing the guest list for the Literacy Foundation event, I replied, the lie coming easily after years of practice. Don't stay up too late with that, he said, moving to his closet to select a fresh shirt. It's just a fundraiser, not a corporate merger. The irony almost made me smile. If he only knew that while he thought I was agonizing over seating arrangements, I was actually structuring the deal that would soon give me control of his company. "How was your day?" I asked, closing my laptop and setting it aside. "You seem stressed." Thomas's shoulders tensed momentarily before he forced them to relax. "Fine. Just the usual challenges of running an actual business." He emphasized the word actual in a way that made it clear my charity work didn't qualify. "We're making some adjustments to the algorithm, nothing serious." Another lie. According to the reports I'd seen, the adjustments involved a fundamental restructuring of the core trading model after its failure to accurately predict market movements during recent volatility. "Is there anything I can do to help?" I offered, knowing exactly what his response would be. He laughed as he buttoned his shirt. "Unless you've secretly become an expert in stochastic calculus since dinner, probably not." If he only knew that. My quantitative team at Meridian had actually published 3 papers on advanced stochastic calculus applications in trading algorithms over the past year. Papers that had become required reading for Goldman's new analysts. "I suppose not," I agreed mildly. "Will you be late tonight?" "Probably. Don't wait up." He finished dressing, gave me a distracted kiss on the cheek, and headed for the door. "Oh, and Olivia? The Blakemores invited us to their lake house this weekend. I already accepted." I nodded, though internally I sighed at having to rearrange my schedule. The Blakemores were potential investors Thomas had been courting, and these weekend invitations were never actually about relaxation. They were extended business meetings where wives were expected to entertain each other while the men talked. Finance. "Edward's wife is on some hospital board, I think," Thomas added as an afterthought. "You two can talk about fundraising or whatever it is you charity ladies discuss." After he left, I reopened my laptop and sent a message to Jessica about the schedule change. Then I returned to the quarterly reports, looking more closely at the algorithmic trading platform's issues. The problems were worse than I'd initially thought. Fundamental design flaws that no amount of adjustments could fix. Thomas had staked his company's future on a fatally flawed system. And when it inevitably failed, Meridian would be perfectly positioned to step in. The next morning, I left our brownstone at 7:30, dressed in the conservative but elegant outfit typical of a financial executive's wife, headed to a charity committee meeting. Thomas had already departed for an early crisis meeting, oblivious to my actual destination. "Good morning, Ms. Hammond." The security guard greeted me as I entered Meridian's discreet Cambridge office through the private entrance. Only here was I addressed by my professional name, the O.P. Hammond, that had become a mysterious figure of interest in financial circles. "Morning, Paul," I replied, switching my designer tote for the sleek laptop bag Jessica handed me as I stepped into the elevator. "Martin Blackwood arrived early," she informed me, efficiently updating me as we ascended to the executive floor. "He's waiting in the conference room. Elaine has the latest projection models ready for review, and the London team sent their arbitrage strategy report at 5 a.m. our time. I've highlighted the key points for you." "Thank you, Jessica. Coffee?" "Already in the conference room. Black, 1 sugar for you, cappuccino for Martin." I smiled appreciatively. Jessica's attention to detail was one of the countless reasons Meridian ran so smoothly. Martin Blackwood stood as I entered the conference room, a courtesy he extended out of genuine respect, unlike the performative gallantry Thomas and his colleagues displayed toward wives at social functions. "Olivia," he said warmly, extending his hand. "Thank you for making time on short notice." "Of course, Martin. Your messages are always a priority." We settled at the conference table, and I noted the tension in his expression despite his attempt at a relaxed demeanor. "I just came from a breakfast meeting with Daniel Cooper," he began without preamble. "The situation at Reynolds Financial is deteriorating faster than anticipated." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral despite the personal connection. "The algorithmic platform issues?" "Yes, but there's more." Martin leaned forward. Thomas presented revised projections to the Eastwood board yesterday. According to Daniel, the numbers were suspiciously optimistic, inconsistent with the platform's actual performance in beta testing. "You think he's manipulating the data?" I asked, though I had already suspected as much from the reports I'd seen. "Daniel didn't say that explicitly," Martin replied carefully. But he mentioned that when questioned about the discrepancies, Thomas became defensive and suggested that Eastwood's technical team didn't fully understand the revolutionary nature of his approach. Typical Thomas, when challenged, resort to condescension rather than addressing legitimate concerns. And Eastwood's position? "They're preparing to withdraw financing," Martin confirmed. Daniel was asking if I knew of any interested parties who might step in before Reynolds collapses entirely. He's concerned about market disruption if they pull out without a replacement investor ready. "Did you mention Meridian?" Martin smiled. "Slightly. Not specifically. I said I might know of an interested party with the capital and expertise to stabilize the situation." His expression grew more serious. "Olivia, they're accelerating their timeline. Eastwood's board is voting next Tuesday instead of at the end of the quarter. This changed our timeline considerably. We'd been preparing for a mid-quarter opportunity, not an immediate one." "How certain are you of the outcome?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. 100%, Martin replied without hesitation. "Eastwood is pulling all financing effective immediately. They're issuing a press release Wednesday morning." I checked the calendar on my tablet. That gave us just 6 days to finalize our acquisition strategy, not the 6 weeks we'd been planning for. "Daniel's worried about fallout," Martin added. "Not just financial, but reputational. Eastwood has backed Reynolds Financial for over 5 years. Questions will be asked about why they didn't spot the issues sooner. Which makes them the perfect first call for Meridian," I noted. "We can position the acquisition as a stability measure, protecting client assets, preserving jobs, maintaining service standards." "Exactly what Daniel needs to hear," Martin agreed. "How quickly can you move?" I opened a new document on my tablet, contingency plans I'd developed months ago, updated regularly as circumstances evolved. By the time Eastwood issues their press release, we'll have term sheets ready for both them and Reynolds Financial's board. Clean, straightforward, minimal disruption. "And Thomas?" Martin asked cautiously. "What will this mean for him personally?" I paused, considering the question. Despite everything, this wasn't about revenge, at least not entirely. The company will collapse, but our prenuptial agreement protects our personal assets. He won't be destitute, just humbled. Martin was quiet for a moment. "And what about you? Are you prepared for your identity as O.P. Hammond to become public knowledge? For Thomas to learn the truth after all these years?" It was the question I'd asked myself countless times over the past 5 years. In the beginning, I'd kept my involvement with Meridian secret out of practical necessity. Thomas would have seen a separate career as competition for my attention, an unwelcome distraction from my real purpose as his wife. Over time, as Meridian grew and I recognized the strategic advantage of anonymity, the secret had evolved into something more complicated. "Yes," I said finally. "It's time." After Martin left, I spent the morning with my executive team, revising timelines and updating acquisition documents. By noon, we had a comprehensive strategy for approaching both Eastwood Ventures and the Reynolds Financial Board, with a solution that would appear to be a rescue rather than an opportunistic takeover. My phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. "Dinner with the Prestons tonight, 8 p.m. at Sorelina. Wear something impressive." I suppressed a sigh. The Prestons were major clients of Reynolds Financial, and this dinner was clearly an attempt to reassure them about the company's stability during a difficult period. Thomas would expect me to play my usual role, the charming, intelligent, but not threatening wife who made strategic small talk while the men discussed business. Little did he know that after 5 years of these dinners, I had compiled a mental database of client concerns, investment priorities, and personal details that would prove invaluable when Meridian took over Reynolds Financial's client relationships. At 7:45 that evening, I entered Soralina in a midnight blue dress that projected elegant sophistication, the perfect costume for my role as supportive wife. Thomas was already at the bar with Richard Preston, both nursing scotch as they discussed what appeared to be market projections on Richard's tablet. Thomas's face brightened when he spotted me, genuine pleasure mixed with pride in my appearance. That was the complexity of our marriage. He truly did care for me, admire me even, just not in the ways that mattered professionally. "Olivia, you look stunning," he said, greeting me with a kiss on the cheek. Richard was just saying he missed seeing you at the last charity gala. Sophia was disappointed, Richard agreed, rising to greet me. She always enjoys your thoughtful conversation, unlike the usual charity circuit chatter. I smiled warmly. Please tell Sophia I missed her too. I'm looking forward to her presentation at the Women's Leadership Forum next month. Richard looked impressed. You're keeping up with Sophia's speaking schedule? That's more than I manage sometimes. Olivia has an exceptional memory for details, Thomas said proudly, as if describing a particularly impressive party trick rather than a professional skill. She remembers everyone's birthdays, children's names, food preferences. It's what makes her such an effective hostess. The reduction of my analytical capabilities to social graces was so typical that I barely registered it anymore. Speaking of details, Richard said, turning back to Thomas, I was hoping we could discuss the recent performance reports. Some of the volatility metrics seem inconsistent with your earlier projections. I watched Thomas's expression carefully, noting the momentary tension around his eyes before his confident smile reasserted itself. Absolutely. Though perhaps we should wait until after dinner? No need to bore Olivia with technical discussions. Actually, I said mildly, I reviewed similar volatility patterns during my time at Goldman. The current market conditions are reminiscent of the pre-correction indicators we tracked in 2018. Both men looked at me with surprise, Thomas with irritation, Richard with sudden interest. You worked at Goldman Sachs? Richard asked. A lifetime ago, Thomas interjected with a laugh, before she discovered her real talents in the nonprofit sector. Shall we move to our table? I believe Caroline has arrived. As he guided us toward the dining room, Thomas's hand pressed firmly against my lower back, a warning not to overstep again. I complied, slipping back into my prescribed role for the remainder of the evening, making thoughtful conversation with Caroline Preston about her children's educational foundation, while the men discussed business in carefully guarded terms. But I noted how Richard's eyes occasionally shifted to me during discussions of market performance, a new speculative interest that suggested he was reassessing his assumptions about Thomas Reynolds's charming wife. It was a small crack in the facade, and in less than a week, the entire structure would come crashing down. The next morning, I arrived at Meridian earlier than usual, determined to be fully prepared for the accelerated timeline. Elaine was already there, coffee in hand and tablet filled with updated financial models. The transition team is assembled, she reported as we walked toward the conference room. Legal has prepared 3 scenarios based on how the Reynolds board might respond. The moment Eastwood announces they're pulling out, we'll be ready to move. And the identity issue? I asked, referring to the imminent revelation that O.P. Hammond and Olivia Reynolds were one and the same. PR has prepared statements for all major financial publications. We're positioning it as a strategic decision to operate independently, rather than as a direct response to Thomas's dismissal. More professional, less personal. I appreciated the approach. While part of me wanted the satisfaction of seeing Thomas forced to acknowledge his misjudgment, the business needed to be protected from appearing as a vehicle for marital drama. What about our people inside Reynolds? I asked. They'll maintain their positions through the transition. Elaine assured me. Martin will broker the initial conversation with the board once Eastwood pulls out. Most of the directors already suspect trouble. They just don't know there's a solution waiting in the wings. Over the next several hours, we refined our approach, identifying key personnel to retain, systems to integrate, and clients to prioritize for personal outreach once the acquisition was announced. Unlike Thomas's expansion strategy, which had prioritized rapid growth over stability, our approach was methodical, built on detailed analysis rather than optimistic projections. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel Cooper. "Lunch tomorrow? Need to talk privately." Rachel's timing was significant, the day before Eastwood's board vote. As Daniel's wife and my secret ally, she likely had information that could impact our strategy. I responded with a simple, "Noon, Catalyst Cafe, Cambridge," a location deliberately chosen for its distance from Thomas's financial district haunts. That evening at home, I found Thomas in his study, surrounded by reports and looking more stressed than I'd seen him in months. The harsh light of his desk lamp accentuated the lines of fatigue around his eyes, and his usually immaculate appearance had given way to rolled sleeves and loosened tie. "Rough day?" I asked from the doorway, balancing 2 glasses of wine. He looked up, momentarily startled as if he'd forgotten he wasn't alone in the house. "You could say that." I entered and placed 1 glass beside him, noting how the quarterly reports were now accompanied by hastily printed emails and what appeared to be technical documentation for the algorithmic platform. "Anything I can do?" I offered, settling into the chair across from his desk. For a moment, something vulnerable flashed across his face, a rare glimpse of the man behind the confident facade. But then it was gone, replaced by his usual dismissive smile. "Unless you've somehow acquired expertise in algorithmic trading models, probably not." He took a long sip of wine. "But thanks for the offer." It was the perfect opportunity to reveal my expertise, to tell him exactly how I could help, to explain that I'd been building advanced trading algorithms for years, while he thought I was planning charity galas. I could have shown him exactly where his platform was failing and how it could be fixed. Instead, I sipped my wine and asked, "Will you be working late again tomorrow?" He nodded, relieved by my retreat to safer conversational territory. Board presentation the next morning, critical one. The Eastwood financing discussion, I knew, though he didn't realize I was aware of it. "I'll be out for lunch tomorrow," I mentioned casually. "Meeting with the Literacy Foundation Committee." Thomas nodded absently, already turning back to, "Is reports? Fine. Oh, and Olivia, let's cancel the Blakemores this weekend. I need to focus on this project." "Of course," I agreed, rising to leave him to his work. "Whatever you need." As I closed the study door behind me, I felt a momentary pang of sympathy. In less than 48 hours, the professional identity he'd spent 15 years building would begin to crumble. The company that bore his name would face existential crisis, and the man who prided himself on financial acumen would be revealed as dangerously over-leveraged and strategically outmatched. And I, the wife he'd dismissed as financially irrelevant, would emerge as his company's only hope for survival. The morning of my lunch with Rachel dawned clear and crisp. I left home early, ostensibly for a foundation meeting, but heading directly to Meridian's offices for final preparation. The atmosphere among my team was focused, but energized. The culmination of years of patient strategy now accelerated into a 48-hour window of opportunity. At 11:45, I headed to Catalyst Cafe, choosing a quiet corner table with a view of both entrances. A habit from my Goldman days when negotiations often required strategic awareness of surroundings. Rachel arrived precisely at noon, dressed in the understated elegance that characterized her professional style. As Daniel Cooper's wife, she could easily have embraced the ostentatious displays of wealth common among financial couples. But she had always maintained her own identity, continuing her work as a professor of economics at Boston University. even after marrying one of the city's most successful venture capitalists. Perhaps that was why she had recognized my facade so quickly. She understood the challenge of maintaining an independent professional identity within Boston's traditional financial marriage structures. "Thank you for meeting on short notice," she said after we'd ordered. Her expression was serious, with none of the casual warmth of our usual social interactions. "Of course," I replied. "I presume this is about Eastwood's board vote tomorrow?" She nodded, glancing around to ensure our privacy before continuing. "It's a formality at this point. The vote will be unanimous to terminate all financing for Reynolds Financial." "That quickly?" I asked, though I'd been preparing for exactly this outcome. "The final analysis came in yesterday," Rachel explained. "The algorithmic platform isn't just underperforming, it's fundamentally flawed. Thomas apparently directed his team to modify the basic architecture without proper testing, and the results are catastrophic." I kept my expression neutral despite the confirmation of what my own analysts had already discovered. How catastrophic? "The model reversed standard risk parameters during last week's test run," Rachel said, her voice lowered. "It recommended maximum position sizes in precisely the securities it should have avoided. If implemented as designed, it would have exposed clients to unprecedented risk." This was worse than even I had anticipated. Not just a failing product, but a dangerous one. "Did Thomas know?" I asked, though I suspected the answer. "That's the most concerning part," Rachel replied. When Daniel confronted him with the test results, Thomas claimed they were anomalies, temporary glitches that would be resolved before full implementation. But Daniel's technical team found evidence that similar failures had occurred in earlier test phases and been deliberately omitted from reports to investors. My stomach tightened. This wasn't just business failure, it was venturing into potential fraud territory. "Daniel's primary concern now is containment," Rachel continued. "He needs to extract Eastwood from this situation without triggering market panic or regulatory scrutiny. A clean, rapid transition to new ownership would be ideal." "And you're telling me this because—" I prompted, though we both knew the answer. Rachel met my gaze directly. "Because Meridian Investment Strategies is perfectly positioned to acquire Reynolds Financial, stabilize its client relationships, and implement actually functional trading algorithms. And because O.P. Hammond has a personal interest in ensuring this transition happens with minimal damage to all parties involved." The explicit acknowledgement of my dual identity hung between us for a moment. "How long have you known?" I asked. "With certainty?" "Since the Morrison Foundation investment last year. The quantitative approach was so distinctive, I recognized it from papers you presented at Harvard. Before that, I had suspicions for nearly 2 years." I nodded slowly. "And Daniel?" "He doesn't know," Rachel replied. "Not yet. I've respected your privacy for the same reason you've maintained it. Women in finance are judged differently. Our successes are scrutinized, our failures magnified. Sometimes invisibility is a strategic advantage. One I'm about to lose," I observed. "True," Rachel acknowledged, "but on your terms, from a position of strength rather than exposure. That makes all the difference." She reached into her bag and removed a slim folder, placing it on the table between us. "These are the internal valuation metrics Eastwood used to assess Reynolds Financial's current worth," she explained. "Not the inflated numbers Thomas has been presenting, but the actual value of the client relationships, intellectual property, and operational infrastructure, stripped of the algorithmic platform's projected revenue." I opened the folder, scanning the figures that would prove invaluable in our acquisition approach. "Why are you helping me, Rachel?" I asked finally. "Beyond the business rationale, why this level of personal involvement?" She was quiet for a moment, considering her response. 7 years ago, I was being considered for the economics department chair at Boston University, she began. I had the publications, the teaching evaluations, the grant funding, everything the position required. But during the final selection, dinner, the dean turned to Daniel and asked what he thought about his wife potentially taking on such a demanding role. Her expression hardened at the memory. Before I could respond, Daniel told him that my research was transforming economic theory, and the university would be making a grave error if they let gender expectations prevent them from appointing the most qualified candidate. She met my gaze again. Thomas would never have said that. He would have laughed and suggested you were too busy with charity work to consider such a role. And the difference matters, Olivia. It matters fundamentally. I nodded, understanding completely. This wasn't just about business strategy or financial success. It was about recognition. About being seen for your capabilities rather than your marital status. About refusing to be diminished by someone else's limited perspective. The acquisition will be announced Thursday morning, I said quietly. Meridian will ensure a smooth transition for all Reynolds clients and retention of all staff except senior management. And Thomas? Rachel asked. The morning of Eastwood's board vote dawned gray and drizzling, matching the somber mood that had descended over our household in recent days. Thomas had barely slept, spending most of the night in his study reviewing financial models and making desperate phone calls to potential investors. He left before dawn without waking me, his side of the bed barely disturbed. I waited until 7 before reaching for my secure phone, checking for updates from Elaine. Her message was brief but definitive. Vote complete. Unanimous withdrawal. Announcement being drafted. Cooper making calls now. And so it begins. I dressed carefully in a charcoal suit with subtle pinstripes, professional and authoritative without being ostentatious. The navy silk blouse beneath added a touch of feminine confidence that would photograph well when the financial press inevitably captured the day's events. These details mattered. The story of Meridian's acquisition of Reynolds Financial would be as much about visuals as financials. As I fastened my grandmother's sapphire earrings, the ones she'd given me upon my Harvard graduation with the reminder that I could achieve anything I set my mind to, my regular phone rang. Thomas's name flashed on the screen. I let it ring, twice before answering, composing my expression even though he couldn't see me. Hello? Olivia. His voice was tight, controlled, but with an undercurrent of panic I'd never heard before. I need you to do something for me. Of course, I said, maintaining the supportive wife role one last time. What do you need? The Prestons, those clients from dinner last week. Call them and secure their portfolio commitment today. We need the management fees. I frowned, genuinely confused. Thomas, that's a $2 million account. It's substantial, but nothing that would impact the company's overall position. Silence hung for a moment before he responded, his voice now edged with irritation. Just make the call, Olivia. We need every bit of cash flow right now. Don't worry about why. Is everything all right? I asked, already knowing the answer, but needing to maintain my pretense of ignorance. Everything's fine, he snapped. Just some temporary liquidity issues. Nothing for you to worry about. Should I call the bank? I could transfer funds from our personal accounts to help. No. The word exploded with such force I had to hold the phone away from my ear. Don't touch our personal accounts. Don't talk to the bank. Just call the Prestons and get that commitment signed. After he hung up, I stood motionless for several moments, contemplating the desperation in his voice. Reynolds Financial was crumbling faster than even I had anticipated. Thomas was grasping at straws, a $2 million account when his company needed tens of millions to stay afloat. My phone buzzed with a message from Martin Blackwood. Reynolds Financial Board emergency meeting called for 2 p.m. Eastwood announcement scheduled for market open tomorrow. We're ready to move when you give. The word. I sent a simple reply. Proceed as planned. Then I made another call, Not to the Prestons, but to Jessica. "I need the car in 20 minutes," I told my assistant, "and I'll need access to the Meridian Executive Suite. It's time." For 5 years, I had maintained a careful separation between my identities. Olivia Reynolds, the decorative wife who managed social calendars and charity events, never visited the downtown offices of Meridian Investment Strategies. O.P. Hammond, the reclusive founder who communicated primarily through trusted lieutenants, never attended the social functions where Olivia Reynolds shone. Today, those identities would merge. As my driver navigated through midday traffic toward downtown, I reviewed the series of events that would unfold over the next 24 hours. By tomorrow morning, Eastwood would announce its withdrawal from all Reynolds Financial projects. By noon, Reynolds' stock would be in free fall. By close of business, the board would be desperately seeking options to avoid complete collapse. And Meridian Investment Strategies, under the leadership of newly revealed CEO Olivia Parker Hammond Reynolds, would offer a lifeline structured as an acquisition rather than a rescue, but positioned to preserve jobs, maintain service to clients, and provide some return to shareholders. My phone buzzed continuously throughout the drive, Thomas calling repeatedly, growing increasingly frantic as the full reality of his situation became clearer. I let the calls go to voicemail, knowing there was nothing I could say that would matter now. The time for pretense had passed. The Meridian headquarters occupied the top 2 floors of a sleek glass tower in Cambridge. Modern, elegant, but deliberately understated compared to the ostentatious Reynolds Financial offices with their marble lobbies and mahogany paneling. I used my private access card, avoiding the main reception area where my appearance might raise questions before we were ready for the reveal. Elaine met me in the executive suite, tablet in hand and expression focused. "The Reynolds board meeting has been moved up to 1 p.m., she said without preamble. "They've received formal notification from Eastwood." "How's Thomas taking it?" I asked, setting down my bag and moving to the window that offered a view of the Boston skyline, including several blocks away, the Reynolds Financial building, where my husband was watching his company disintegrate. "Not well," Elaine said diplomatically. "Martin says he's cycling between denial and rage, insisting the numbers are wrong, that Eastwood is making a terrible mistake, that his team has failed him." But not considering that he might have failed them, I noted. It was consistent with Thomas's character. Success was his achievement alone. Failure was always someone else's responsibility. "The acquisition team is ready," Elaine continued, professional as always. "Term sheets, financing structure, transition plans, everything is prepared. We're just waiting on your final review." I turned from the window to face the conference table where the future of both companies lay in neatly organized folders. 5 years of planning, of patient strategy and careful positioning, condensed into documents that would transform Boston's financial landscape. "Walk me through it one more time," I said, taking a seat at the head of the table. "I want to be certain we've considered every angle." For the next hour, Elaine and I reviewed the acquisition strategy in meticulous detail. The approach was clean, business-focused, and deliberately devoid of personal elements. Meridian would acquire Reynolds Financial's assets at fair market value, retain the majority of staff, honor existing client contracts, and rebuild the fatally flawed algorithmic platform using our proven models. The personal satisfaction of seeing Thomas finally recognize my capabilities was secondary to ensuring the business transition succeeded. As we concluded our review, my phone lit up with another call from Thomas. This time I answered. "Olivia, where are you?" His voice was ragged, desperate in a way I'd never heard before. "I've been calling for hours." "I had some errands to run," I said calmly. "Is everything all right?" A harsh laugh came through the line. "No, everything is not all right. Everything is falling apart. Eastwood has pulled all financing. The board is in panic mode. The algorithm was..." He stopped abruptly, seeming to remember who he was talking to. Never mind. I need you to come to the office. I need to figure out what to tell our friends, how to manage the social fallout when this hits the news. Even now, in the midst of professional catastrophe, his concern about my role focused on appearances and social dynamics, the perfect wife to manage the optics while he handled the real issues. I'm afraid I can't come to the office just yet, I said. I have a meeting. A meeting? His voice rose incredulously. Olivia, I don't think you understand the severity of what's happening. Whatever charity luncheon or fundraiser you're planning can wait. It's not a charity meeting, Thomas, I replied, my tone remaining steady. It's a board meeting at Meridian. Investment strategies. The silence that followed stretched for several seconds. Meridian? He sounded genuinely confused. That boutique firm that's been acquiring market share from our competitors? What does that have to do with you? Everything, I said simply. I founded it 5 years ago. I'm the CEO, and tomorrow we'll be making an offer to acquire the assets of Reynolds Financial. The silence returned, longer this time, broken only by the sound of his breathing. That's not funny, Olivia, he finally said, his voice dangerously quiet. It's not meant to be, I replied. I'll see you at home tonight. We have a lot to discuss. I ended the call before he could respond, turning back to Elaine, who had witnessed the exchange with professional restraint. It's done, I said. Alert. The team. We move forward first thing tomorrow morning. The house was dark when I arrived home, save for a single light burning in Thomas's study. I found him there, slumped in his leather chair, an empty glass in one hand and a half-empty bottle of scotch on the desk before him. The man who had left that morning, harried but still commanding, still certain of his ability to solve any crisis, had been replaced by someone I barely recognized. His normally impeccable appearance had disintegrated. Tie loosened, shirt wrinkled, hair disheveled from repeatedly running his hands through it. He didn't look up when I entered, though he must have heard me. For a long moment, the only sound was the gentle ticking of the antique clock on the mantel, a wedding gift from his parents, a reminder of the Reynolds legacy he had been so determined to enhance. Is it true? He finally asked, voice hoarse. I set down my bag and moved to the chair opposite his desk, smoothing my skirt as I sat, a habitual gesture from countless business meetings. Yes, I said simply. He looked up then, his eyes bloodshot, but lucid. How long? I founded Meridian 5 years ago. 5 years, he repeated, a bitter smile twisting his lips. 5 years of lying to my face. I never lied, I corrected calmly. You never asked. You never showed any interest in what I did with my time as long as I was available when you needed a hostess or a social secretary. Don't put this on me, he snapped, anger briefly overtaking his exhaustion. You deliberately hid this. You operated a competing business behind my back. Not competing, I said. Different market segments, different investment strategies, different management approaches. Reynolds Financial and Meridian have only begun to overlap recently. He laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. Overlapped, is that what you call this? You're trying to take over my company. I'm offering to acquire Reynolds Financial's assets at fair market value, I corrected, which, given Eastwood's withdrawal and the algorithmic platform's failure, is significantly more generous than any other offer you're likely to receive. Thomas stared at me as if seeing a stranger. Perhaps he was. Who are you? He whispered. The same person I've always been, I replied. The Harvard graduate who caught your eye at the Financial Innovation Conference. The analyst who had 3 promotions in 4 years at Goldman Sachs. The woman who suggested the Morrison portfolio acquisition that became your highest performing institutional client. I leaned forward, holding his gaze. I'm the wife who listened when you mocked my financial acumen at dinner parties. The wife who watched you take credit for my insights because you couldn't imagine they had originated with me. The wife who finally realized that no matter what I achieved, you would only ever see me as an extension of yourself, a decorative accessory rather than a partner. Something flickered in his eyes, confusion perhaps, or the first glimmer of recognition. So this is revenge? You built a company just to destroy mine? No, Thomas, I said with a sigh. I built a company because I'm good at building companies. I kept it separate from our marriage because you made it abundantly clear you didn't want a wife with ambitions that might compete with yours. And I'm acquiring Reynolds Financial because it's a sound business decision for Meridian shareholders. Nothing more, nothing less. He drained his glass and reached for the bottle, pouring another generous measure. You must have enjoyed it, he said, bitterness edging his words. Sitting there at all those client dinners, listening to me talk about the business while you secretly ran your own, laughing at me behind my back. I never laughed at you, Thomas, I said quietly. I admired your vision, your ambition. I still do, but I couldn't respect the way you dismissed mine. He slammed the glass down, scotch sloshing over the rim. Then why not just leave? Why the elaborate deception for 5 years? It was the question I had asked myself countless times, the answer evolving as both Meridian and our marriage had changed. At first, it was simpler to keep my professional life separate, I explained. You were so resistant to the idea of me working at all, let alone building something independent of you. Later, as Meridian grew, I recognized the strategic advantage of anonymity. The financial world treats female CEOs differently, subjects them to additional scrutiny, different standards. As O.P. Hammond, I could build without those constraints. And now? He challenged. Why reveal yourself now? Because the situation demands it, I replied simply. Reynolds Financial needs a solution, and Meridian is positioned to provide one. Keeping my identity secret now would create more problems than it solves. Thomas studied me, some of his analytical capacity seeming to return despite the scotch. The Cooper connection, he said slowly. Rachel knew, didn't she? That's why Eastwood pulled out. They were already planning to back you. Eastwood pulled out because your numbers didn't add up, I corrected. The algorithmic platform was fundamentally flawed, the expansion cost concealed, the performance metrics misrepresented. They would have withdrawn regardless of my involvement. But they knew, he insisted. They knew you were waiting to swoop in and pick up the pieces. I sighed, recognizing that in his current state, Thomas needed someone to blame besides himself. Rachel figured it out on her own. She recognized my quantitative approach in Meridian's investment models. But Eastwood's decision was based on Reynolds Financial's performance, not on Meridian's acquisition plans. He shook his head, unwilling or unable to accept this explanation. All those years, he muttered. All those client dinners where I brought you along to charm the investors, and you were studying them, planning to steal them. No one is stealing anything, Thomas, I said firmly. This is business. Your company expanded too aggressively, leveraged too heavily, and failed to maintain proper controls. Now it's facing the consequences of those decisions. My decisions, he corrected, voice hardening. Say it, Olivia. This is my failure. Not entirely, I acknowledged. Your finance team bears responsibility for the misleading projections. Your board should have provided better oversight. Eastwood should have conducted more thorough due diligence before backing the expansion. I paused, meeting his gaze directly. But yes, ultimately the culture that allowed this to happen comes from the top, from you. He flinched as if I'd struck him. For a moment, I thought he might lash out, his knuckles whitening around the glass. But then his shoulders sagged, the fight draining from him as suddenly as it had flared. So what happens now? He asked, voice hollow. Tomorrow morning, Eastwood will announce they're terminating all financing for Reynolds Financial, I explained, shifting into the calm, professional tone I used in board meetings. Your stock will likely be halted after dropping below critical thresholds. By midday, your board will be fielding panic calls from other lenders and investors. By close of business, they'll be considering bankruptcy protection to prevent a complete collapse. I reached into my bag and removed a slim folder, placing it on the desk between us. This contains the preliminary terms of Meridian Investment. Strategies offer to acquire Reynolds Financial's assets. It's a fair valuation given the circumstances, significantly more generous than what vulture firms would offer once news of the algorithmic platform's failure becomes public. Thomas made no move to touch the folder. And if I fight this? If I convince the board to reject your offer? That's your prerogative, I acknowledged. But without immediate financing to cover the Eastwood withdrawal, Reynolds Financial will default on its loans within 30 days. Client accounts will become unstable, staff will face layoffs, and your personal reputation in the financial community will be irreparably damaged. I leaned forward slightly. Fighting won't save the company, Thomas. It will only destroy more value for everyone involved: shareholders, employees, clients. He reached for the folder then, opening it with unsteady hands. His eyes scanned the terms, professional training temporarily overriding emotional response. "You're keeping the Reynolds name on the wealth management division," he noted, surprise evident in his voice. "It's a strong brand with loyal clients," I confirmed. "Erasing it would be poor business, regardless of personal considerations." "And the staff?" he asked, continuing to read. "Retained, with the exception of certain executive positions that would become redundant in the merged organization." He looked up sharply. "Including mine?" "Yes," I said simply, "including yours, though the terms include a generous consulting contract if you wish to remain involved during the transition." Thomas closed the folder, pushing it away as if the physical distance might somehow change its contents. "So that's it? 7 years of marriage, 15 years building Reynolds Financial, and it all ends with you taking over while I become a footnote in my own company's history?" "The business outcomes were determined by business decisions," I said, keeping my voice steady. "As for our marriage, that's a separate conversation, one we should probably have when you're sober." He laughed again, that same hollow sound. Always so controlled, so rational. Was that real at least? Or was the perfect supportive wife just another business strategy? The question stung more than I had expected. "I loved you, Thomas," I said quietly. "I still care for you, but I stopped being your partner years ago, if I ever truly was. I became your accessory, your net negative on the balance sheet, and neither of us seemed to know how to change that dynamic." "Except you did," he pointed out. "You built a company that's now poised to acquire mine. That's quite a change in dynamics." "True," I acknowledged, "though not the one I would have preferred." He rubbed his face tiredly. "What would you have preferred?" "A marriage between equals," I said without hesitation. "A husband who valued my mind as much as my social skills. A partner who didn't feel threatened by my ambitions or dismissive of my capabilities." For a moment, something like regret flickered across his features. "When did I start seeing you that way? As a liability rather than an asset?" The question seemed genuine, the first hint that he might be capable of self-reflection beneath the anger and humiliation. "It was gradual," I said truthfully. "Small comments at first, harmless-seeming jokes about my financial opinions. Then more deliberate dismissals when I offered suggestions. Eventually, it became your default, introducing me only in relation to you, explaining to others what I couldn't possibly understand, defining my value entirely through how I enhanced your image." I stood, suddenly weary of the conversation. "Review the terms, Thomas. Sleep on it. We can discuss the details tomorrow after the Eastwood announcement." As I turned to leave, he spoke again. his voice softer than before. Was I really so blind? I paused in the doorway, looking back at the man I had once believed would be my partner in all things. You saw what you expected to see, I said gently. And you never expected your wife to be anything more than a line item on your personal balance sheet. Morning arrived with the oppressive weight of Thomas's hangover and the relentless ping of his phone receiving message after message. I was already showered and dressed in a tailored navy suit when he finally stirred, groaning as consciousness brought the full impact of the previous night's excesses. "What time is it?" he mumbled, shielding his eyes from the sunlight filtering through the automated blinds. "Just after 8, I replied, setting a glass of water and 2 aspirin on his nightstand. "You have 12 missed calls, mostly from James Mitchell." James was Reynolds Financial's chief financial officer, a man who had consistently enabled Thomas's most aggressive growth strategies while minimizing risk concerns. I'd interacted with him at numerous company functions, where he'd invariably treated me with the same dismissive cordiality as Thomas did, the boss's wife, to be humored but never taken seriously. Thomas grabbed his phone, squinting at the screen. "Damn it," he muttered, immediately hitting the call back button. I moved toward the door, giving him privacy for what was clearly an urgent business matter, but his next words froze me in place. "James, slow down," he said, voice still rough with sleep. "What do you mean, discrepancies? Those projections were vetted by the entire finance team." I paused, watching as Thomas's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "That's impossible," he insisted. "The algorithm is performing exactly as forecasted. I saw the reports myself last quarter." Another pause as he listened, his face draining of color. "Emergency board meeting at 1? No, you're overreacting. Call Daniel. Tell him it's a simple misunderstanding. We'll clarify the numbers tomorrow." As Thomas continued his increasingly desperate conversation, I slipped quietly from the room, my mind already shifting to the cascade of events now set in motion. By this time tomorrow, the carefully constructed facade of Reynolds Financial's growth strategy would begin to crack. By the end of the week, the company Thomas had spent 15 years building would be on the verge of collapse. And Meridian, my company, would be perfectly positioned to acquire the pieces. Thomas moved through the house like a man possessed, barking orders into his phone while frantically gathering documents. His typical morning routine, leisurely breakfast, financial. Times review, carefully selected tie, had been abandoned in favor of crisis management. "I need everyone at the office in 1 hour," he snapped to someone on the other end of the call. "Everyone, James. I don't care if it's their day off. Cancel whatever brunch reservations or tennis matches or whatever the hell else. This is an emergency." I busied myself in the kitchen, preparing a light breakfast he wouldn't eat and coffee he would gulp down without tasting. The routine was familiar from previous crises, though none had carried the weight of this one. "Olivia," he called, appearing in the doorway with his tie askew and hair still damp from his rushed shower. "I need to go into the office. Emergency. Situation." "Of course," I replied, sliding a travel mug of coffee across the counter. "Anything I can help with?" He laughed, a short, distracted sound with an edge of hysteria. "Unless you've suddenly become an expert in financial algorithm. Stabilization, probably not." The irony was almost too perfect. My quantitative team at Meridian had literally written the book on algorithm stabilization during market volatility, a text now used by several major investment banks. "There's some confusion with our expansion. Numbers," he continued, grabbing the coffee without making eye contact. "Nothing serious, just bureaucratic nonsense that needs sorting." The lie came easily to him. Whether to protect me or himself, I couldn't be sure. Perhaps both. "Should I cancel our dinner with the Harringtons tonight?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Yes, he said distractedly, checking his watch. "Make my apologies. Say I've come down with something. Nothing serious, just indisposed." Of course, I repeated, the dutiful wife managing social obligations while her husband handled important matters. He paused at the door, seeming to remember something. Oh, and I might be late tonight. Don't wait up. With that, he was gone, the sound of his Audi's engine revving aggressively as he tore down the driveway. I waited until the sound faded before reaching for my own phone, not my regular iPhone, but the secure device I used for Meridian business. He's on his way to the office, I told Elaine when she answered, gathering the executive team for an emergency meeting. We know, she replied, her voice professionally calm despite the high-stakes situation unfolding. Martin just called. He's been summoned as part of the investor group. Thomas is trying to secure emergency bridge financing to cover the algorithm failure and prevent Eastwood's withdrawal from becoming public. Will he succeed? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Not a chance, Elaine said confidently. Our team has been quietly speaking with all potential sources. No one's willing to throw good money after bad, especially with the Eastwood. Announcement happening tomorrow morning. I moved to my home office, closing the door before continuing. What's our status? Term sheets are ready, Elaine confirmed. Legal has prepared 3 scenarios based on how the board responds. The moment Eastwood announces they're pulling out, we'll be ready to move. And the identity issue? I asked, referring to the imminent revelation that O.P. Hammond and Olivia Reynolds were one and the same. PR has prepared statements for all major publications. We're positioning it as a strategic decision to operate independently rather than as a direct response to Thomas's dismissal. More professional, less personal. I appreciated the approach. While part of me wanted the satisfaction of seeing Thomas forced to acknowledge his misjudgment, the business needed to be protected from appearing as a vehicle for marital drama. What about our people inside Reynolds? I asked. They'll maintain their positions through the transition, Elaine assured me. Martin will broker the initial conversation with the board once Eastwood pulls out. Most of the directors already suspect trouble. They just don't know there's a solution waiting in the wings. I ended the call and spent the next hour reviewing financial projections and acquisition scenarios. Unlike Thomas's frantic scramble to salvage his overextended expansion, my preparation had been methodical, developed over years rather than hours. By the time I changed into a simple but elegant ensemble appropriate for the meetings that would soon be necessary, I felt a strange calm. The storm was breaking, but I had built my shelter long ago. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel Cooper. Board vote complete. Unanimous decision to terminate all financing. Daniel making calls now. I checked the time. 10:23 a.m. Earlier than expected. The dominoes would begin falling immediately. As if on cue, my regular phone lit up with Thomas's name. I let it ring twice before answering, composing my expression even though he couldn't see me. Hello? Olivia. His voice was tight, controlled, but with an undercurrent of panic I'd never heard from him before. Where are you? At home, I replied, keeping my tone neutral. Is everything all right? No, everything is not all right, he snapped. I'm in the middle of the biggest crisis of my career, and I need you to come to the office. This was unexpected. Thomas had never wanted me involved in company matters before. Of course, I said carefully. What do you need me to do? The board wants to meet with you, he said, the words seeming to physically pain him. They know about Meridian. Ah, so it had begun. I see, I replied, maintaining my composure. When? Now, Olivia, he nearly growled. Right now. I'll be there in 30 minutes, I said, already moving toward my closet to select a different jacket, something more authoritative for what would undoubtedly be a pivotal meeting. And Olivia? He added, his voice suddenly quieter. Is it true? What Martin Blackwood told the board? That you built a $1 billion investment firm right under my nose? I paused, considering my response carefully. We have a lot to discuss, Thomas. But this isn't a conversation to have over the phone. His bitter laugh carried through the line. 5 years married to a financial genius, and I never saw it. Talk about mispricing an asset. The line went dead before I could respond. Reynolds Financial occupied the top 10 floors of a granite and glass tower in Boston's financial district, an imposing structure designed to project stability and timeless wealth. As my car pulled up to the entrance, I noted the unusual activity for a Tuesday morning. Security guards checking credentials more carefully than normal. Small clusters of employees huddled in concerned conversation near the outdoor smoking area. Word was spreading. The company was in trouble. The executive elevator, the one Thomas had once proudly shown me as a symbol of his success, whisked me directly to the 40th floor. Jessica was waiting when the doors opened. The board is assembled in the main conference room, she informed me quietly as we walked. Martin Blackwood made the initial disclosure about your role at Meridian approximately 40 minutes ago, after Thomas attempted to identify alternative financing sources. And Thomas's reaction? I asked. Initially dismissive, then hostile. Finally resigned, Jessica reported efficiently. The board chair requested your presence as soon as Thomas confirmed your conversation last night. We paused outside the heavy mahogany doors of the conference room. Meridian's acquisition team? I asked. On standby, Jessica confirmed. Term sheets are prepared, legal is ready to move, and PR has both announcements drafted, the immediate response to Eastwood's withdrawal and the subsequent acquisition offer. I nodded, taking a deep breath to center myself. This was the moment 5 years of careful planning had been building toward, though it had arrived more abruptly than anticipated. Let's not keep them waiting. The tension in the conference room was palpable as I entered. 12 people sat around the massive table, their expressions ranging from shock to curiosity to barely concealed anger. Thomas stood at the far end, his earlier dishevelment now replaced with rigid control, though the strain showed in the tightness around his eyes. Martin Blackwood rose to greet me, an act of professional courtesy that felt symbolically significant in this charged atmosphere. Ms. Hammond, he said, deliberately using my professional name rather than Mrs. Reynolds. Thank you for joining us on such short notice. Thank you for the invitation, I replied, taking the seat he indicated, not beside Thomas, but at the opposite end of the table, the position typically reserved for equal counterparties in negotiations. As I'm sure you're aware, began Eleanor Winters, the board chair, we find ourselves in an extraordinary situation. This morning, we received formal notification that Eastwood Ventures is terminating all financial support for Reynolds Financial's algorithmic trading platform, effective immediately. I nodded, maintaining a neutral expression. Subsequently, she continued, we learned from Mr. Blackwood that you are, in fact, the founder and CEO of Meridian Investment Strategies, a fact that was apparently unknown to your husband until yesterday evening. Her tone carried a mixture of disbelief and reluctant admiration. As one of the few female executives to break through Boston's financial old boys network, Eleanor had faced her own battles against dismissal and underestimation. That is correct, I confirmed. And is it also correct, she pressed, that Meridian is prepared to present an acquisition offer for Reynolds Financial's assets? Yes, I said simply. The term sheets are ready to present whenever the board is prepared to receive them. Thomas made a sound, something between a laugh and a groan, but remained otherwise silent. James Mitchell, the CFO who had been Thomas's right hand throughout the expansion, leaned forward with poorly disguised hostility. So you've been planning this all along? Building a competing firm with the express purpose of taking over your husband's company? No, I replied calmly. I built Meridian because I'm a quantitative finance specialist with valuable insights that weren't being utilized elsewhere. The acquisition opportunity arose only when Reynolds Financial's expansion strategy created unsustainable leverage and technological failures. "And you knew about these failures?" Eleanor asked, her gaze sharp. "My team conducted the same analysis any potential investor would perform," I explained. "The algorithm's fundamental flaws became apparent during routine due diligence. Yet, you said nothing to your husband," James accused, "even knowing his company was heading for crisis." I met his gaze steadily. "Did you alert the board when you first identified problems with the algorithm's performance? When the error rates in testing exceeded acceptable parameters? When the development costs ran 40% over budget?" His face flushed, and he looked away. His silence was answer enough. "Thomas created a culture where bearers of bad news were punished rather than rewarded," I continued. "A culture where performance problems were concealed rather than addressed. A culture where his vision was to be supported rather than questioned. That culture extended from Reynolds Financial into our marriage." I turned to look directly at Thomas, who was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Anger mixed with something that might have been dawning respect. "I tried to offer insights early in our marriage," I told the board. "I suggested adjustments to risk parameters, questioned growth projections, proposed alternative development approaches. Each time, I was dismissed as someone who couldn't possibly understand the complexities involved." Eleanor's expression softened slightly. "So you built Meridian instead?" "Yes," I acknowledged. "And now Meridian is in a position to acquire Reynolds Financial at fair market value, preserve its client relationships, retain its non-executive staff, and replace the failed algorithmic platform with our proven quantitative models, which have outperformed market indices by an average of 22% annually," Martin added, his tone deliberately matter-of-fact, "while maintaining risk levels well below industry standards." The board members exchanged glances, the reality of the situation becoming clearer. Reynolds Financial was effectively insolvent without Eastwood's backing. The algorithmic platform that was supposed to revolutionize their business model had failed, and the only potential acquirer with the expertise and motivation to preserve, rather than dismantle their company, was sitting at the other end of the table from their founder. "I think," Eleanor said carefully, "we would like to review those term sheets now." I nodded to Jessica, who distributed the prepared documents to each board member. For several minutes, the room was silent except for the rustle of pages turning and the occasional murmur as someone noted a particular provision. I watched Thomas as he read, seeing the precise moment when he recognized that the terms were actually quite generous given the circumstances. His shoulders relaxed slightly, the defensive tension giving way to pragmatic assessment. "These terms preserve the Reynolds name on the wealth management division," Eleanor noted, looking up from her copy. "Yes," I confirmed. "It's a respected brand with loyal clients. Changing it would be disruptive and unnecessary." "And the retention bonuses for key personnel," James observed, his earlier hostility somewhat tempered. "They're more substantial than standard acquisition packages." "Continuity is vital in financial services," I explained. "Clients stay with advisors they trust. We want those advisors to remain with the merged organization." "What's your timeline?" Eleanor asked. "We're prepared to announce the acquisition immediately following Eastwood's public withdrawal tomorrow morning," I replied. "The markets will react negatively to Eastwood's announcement, but news of a stable transition to Meridian's management should mitigate the worst effects for shareholders." Eleanor looked at Thomas, who had remained uncharacteristically silent throughout this discussion. "Thomas, your thoughts on these terms?" All eyes turned to my husband, the man who had built Reynolds Financial from a 3-person advisory firm into a significant player in Boston's investment community, and who had then leveraged its stability on a technological gamble that had failed catastrophically. Thomas set down the term sheet and looked directly at me, his expression complex. "The terms are fair," he said finally, his voice steady despite. the personal humiliation he must have been feeling. More than fair, given our position. Meridian is offering stability for our clients, continuity for our staff, and some value for our shareholders, all of which would be lost in a bankruptcy scenario, which is our only alternative at this point. He turned to address the board. I recommend accepting these terms, with the addition of a 2-week transition period during which I will personally introduce key clients to... He paused, the professional mask slipping momentarily. To Ms. Hammond and her team. The formal use of my professional name rather than my wife, or Olivia, was not lost on anyone present. It represented a fundamental shift in how Thomas was choosing to frame this situation, not as a marital betrayal, but as a business transaction between equals. Eleanor looked around the table, reading the room. I believe we should discuss this matter privately. Ms. Hammond, would you be willing to step out while the board deliberates? Of course, I agreed, rising from my seat. I'll be available whenever you reach a decision. As I moved toward the door, Thomas spoke again. Olivia. I turned, surprised by his use of my personal name after the careful formality of his previous statement. Did you ever consider telling me about Meridian? He asked, and for the first time since I'd entered the room, I heard genuine curiosity rather than accusation in his voice. Was there ever a moment when you thought we could have built something together instead of in opposition? The question caught me off guard with its unexpected vulnerability. The board members shifted uncomfortably, suddenly witnesses to a personal exchange in what had until now been framed as a purely business discussion. Many times, I answered honestly, especially in the beginning. But each time I tried to engage with you on financial matters, you made it clear that you saw no value in my perspective. Eventually, I stopped trying. He nodded slowly, absorbing this. I see. I left the conference room then, the heavy door closing behind me with a soft but definitive click. Jessica was waiting in the adjacent meeting room, tablet in hand. Well? She asked. They're deliberating, I replied, but I believe they'll accept our terms. Thomas himself recommended approval. Jessica raised an eyebrow at this unexpected development. That's surprising. Yes, I agreed, moving to the window that overlooked Boston Harbor. It is. For 5 years, I had maintained a clear separation between Olivia Reynolds and O.P. Hammond, between my personal identity as Thomas's underestimated wife and my professional identity as Meridian's respected founder. Now those identities were converging, and the boundary between marital dynamics and business realities was blurring in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. I had prepared meticulously for every aspect of the acquisition: the financial projections, the legal considerations, the client transition plans, the PR strategy. But I hadn't prepared for the look in Thomas's eyes when he asked if we could have built something together. The genuine regret for a partnership that might have been, if only he had been able to see me clearly from the beginning. Ms. Hammond? Eleanor Winters was at the door. The board is ready for you. I turned from the window, composing myself. Thank you. As I re-entered the conference room, I noted the shifted energy, the resignation and acceptance that had replaced the earlier tension and hostility. These were experienced financial professionals who recognized when a situation had passed the point of rescue and entered the phase of damage control. After careful consideration, Eleanor began once I was seated, the board has voted unanimously to accept Meridian Investment Strategies' acquisition offer, subject to the 2-week client transition period Thomas suggested. I nodded, the momentous nature of this decision settling over me. 5 years of building in the shadows had culminated in this moment, not in triumph, as I might once have imagined, but in a complex mix of professional satisfaction and personal reckoning. We'll have our legal team coordinate with yours immediately to finalize the documentation, Eleanor continued. Our primary concern now is managing tomorrow's market reaction to minimize shareholder losses. Meridian's PR team has prepared a coordinated announcement, I assured her. It will be released within minutes of Eastwood's statement, emphasizing continuity and stability rather than focusing on the algorithmic platform's failures. Good, Eleanor said with evident relief. And She hesitated, clearly uncertain how to frame the personal aspect of this situation. The revelation of my identity as both Mrs. Reynolds and O.P. Hammond will be handled professionally, I assured. The focus will remain on the business rationale for the acquisition, not on personal dynamics. She nodded gratefully. Thank you. As the meeting concluded and board members began to disperse, Thomas approached me. The others discreetly created space around us, recognizing the need for a private moment amidst this public business decision. We should talk, he said quietly. Not here, not now, but soon. Yes, I agreed. We should. I'll be late tonight, he added. There are clients I need to call personally before they hear about this from other sources. I understand. He studied me for a moment as if seeing me properly for the first time in years. You know, in all our time together, I never once asked about your work at Goldman. What you actually did, what you learned, what insights you developed. I just assumed it was less significant than my own experience. Yes, I acknowledged. Simply, that was a mistake, he said, the admission clearly difficult for him. One of many, it seems. Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, shoulders straight despite the professional catastrophe unfolding around him. Even in defeat, Thomas Reynolds maintained the bearing of someone accustomed to command, a quality I had once admired, and eventually learned to see as both his greatest strength and his fundamental limitation. Jessica appeared at my side. Elaine is on the secure line. The team is waiting for confirmation to proceed with tomorrow's announcements. I took a deep breath, the weight of 5 years of careful strategy culminating in this moment of decision. Tell them we're moving forward as planned, I said. The acquisition is approved. The morning of the acquisition announcement dawned with the clinical precision of long-anticipated consequences. The Boston financial district buzzed with speculation as news of Eastwood Ventures' withdrawal from Reynolds Financial broke at market open, sending the company's stock plummeting and triggering a temporary trading halt. I watched from Meridian's executive suite as financial analysts scrambled to explain the sudden collapse of what had been considered one of Boston's most reliable investment firms. Eastwood's announcement just hit the wires, Elaine reported, tablet in hand. Reynolds' stock dropped 42% before the circuit breakers kicked in. Trading has been halted. I nodded, reviewing our prepared statement one final time. Release our announcement in exactly 7 minutes. I want the markets to absorb the Eastwood news fully before we introduce the acquisition. The statement had been crafted with surgical precision, factual, forward-looking, and deliberately devoid of personal elements. It announced Meridian Investment Strategies' acquisition of Reynolds Financial's assets, outlined the transition plan for clients and employees, and introduced O.P. Hammond as Olivia Parker Hammond Reynolds. The professional credentials were highlighted. The personal connection was acknowledged but not emphasized. What's the status at Reynolds? I asked, gazing out the window toward their headquarters several blocks away. Martin reports barely controlled chaos, Jessica said, checking her secure messages. Thomas is meeting with the executive team now, preparing them for our announcement. He's being surprisingly constructive, according to Martin. This was unexpected. I had anticipated resistance, perhaps even sabotage, not cooperation. The board chair is requesting you appear at Reynolds at 11 to address the senior management team jointly with Thomas, Jessica continued. She feels it would demonstrate stability and continuity to have both of you present when they learn about the acquisition. I checked my watch, 9:17 a.m., less than 2 hours to prepare for a meeting I hadn't anticipated. Confirm that I'll be there, I decided. and arrange for the transition team leaders to join me. If we're addressing management, we should be prepared to answer their immediate questions about reporting structures and operational changes. The next 90 minutes passed in a whirlwind of activity. Meridian's announcement hit the financial press exactly as planned, moderating but not eliminating the market damage to Reynolds Financial. Trading resumed with the stock down 28% from the previous day's close. Significant, but not catastrophic, given the circumstances. The financial media's reaction was predictably sensationalistic. Headlines like "Wife's Secret Empire Saves Husband's Failing Firm" and "Mrs. Reynolds Revealed as Financial Genius Behind Meridian" dominated the financial news sites, while more serious publications focused on the technological failures that had precipitated Reynolds Financial's crisis. "CNBC is requesting an interview," Elaine informed me as we prepared to leave for the Reynolds offices. "So are Bloomberg, the Wall Street Journal, and practically every financial publication in the country. Decline them all for today," I instructed. "The story right now is about market stabilization and client protection, not personal drama. We'll consider interviews later this week once the transition is underway." As our car approached the Reynolds Financial building, I noted the news vans already assembled outside, reporters doing live stand-ups against the backdrop of what would soon be a Meridian acquisition. Security was heightened, with additional personnel checking credentials at the entrance, a wise precaution given the circumstances. "The press statement is holding well," Jessica reported, checking her tablet as we entered through a private access point. "Business outlets are focusing on the algorithmic platform failure rather than the personal narrative. Your Harvard classmates are providing excellent background on your quantitative finance expertise without addressing the marital angle." I smiled slightly at this detail, my network mobilizing exactly as we'd anticipated, shifting the story from domestic drama to business reality. The executive floor of Reynolds Financial presented a study in controlled crisis. Staff moved purposefully but with obvious tension, while security personnel maintained watch over sensitive areas. We were escorted directly to the main conference room where Thomas and the senior management team waited. Thomas stood as I entered, his expression composed despite the extraordinary circumstances. He wore the same charcoal suit he'd worn the day we met at the Financial Innovation Conference 7 years ago, a detail I couldn't help but notice and wondered if he'd chosen deliberately. "Olivia," he said, his tone formal but not cold. "Thank you for coming." "Thomas," I acknowledged with a nod, taking my position at the opposite end of the conference table. Not confrontational, but clearly establishing separate leadership presences. The 20 senior managers seated around the table watched our interaction with barely disguised fascination. Most knew me only as Thomas's wife, the charity foundation organizer who appeared at company events. The revelation of my true professional identity had clearly shaken their understanding of both their CEO and his marriage. "I've already informed the team about Eastwood's withdrawal and the resulting financial situation," Thomas began, addressing the room with remarkable composure. "They understand that Reynolds Financial cannot continue as an independent entity under these circumstances." Murmurs of confirmation circulated among the executives, their expressions a mixture of resignation and anxiety. "What they don't yet know," Thomas continued, "is that we've secured an acquisition agreement that will preserve the core of what we've built together over the past 15 years. He looked at me, a silent invitation to take over the narrative. It was a surprisingly generous gesture from a man who had always dominated every conversation. "Meridian Investment Strategies will acquire Reynolds Financial's assets effective immediately," I said, my voice calm and authoritative. "The Reynolds name will be maintained for the wealth management division. All client relationships will be preserved, and all non-executive staff will be retained at their current compensation levels." I paused, allowing this information to register. Relief visibly washed over several faces. Jobs would be secure, Clients wouldn't flee en masse. The company wouldn't simply disappear. The failed algorithmic trading platform will be replaced with Meridian's proprietary quantitative models, which have consistently outperformed market indices by an average of 22% annually over the past 5 years. James Mitchell, the CFO, leaned forward with obvious skepticism. "With respect, Mrs. Reynolds. Ms. Hammond in this context, please," I corrected calmly. He faltered momentarily before continuing. "Ms. Hammond, those performance figures seem extraordinarily optimistic. Our own quantitative team reviewed all major algorithmic strategies and found nothing approaching those numbers consistently." "Your team didn't have access to Meridian's models," I replied, opening my tablet and projecting a performance chart onto the room's main screen. "These returns have been verified by 3 independent auditing firms and accepted by institutional clients, including 4 university endowments and 6 public pension funds." The room fell silent as the executives studied the data. Not inflated projections or manipulated metrics, but actual, verified performance across multiple market conditions. "How?" asked Diana Chen, the head of research who had struggled unsuccessfully to make Thomas's algorithmic platform deliver on its promises. "These volatility adjustments during market corrections are... I've never seen anything like this. The core innovation is a dynamic risk-weighting model that incorporates non-traditional data sets," I explained, speaking directly to her. "Technical understanding rather than dumbing down the explanation as Thomas might have done. We developed a proprietary approach to correlation analysis that significantly outperforms standard deviation metrics during market disruptions." Diana's eyes widened with professional appreciation. "The holy grail of quantitative finance," she murmured, clearly reassessing everything she thought she knew about her CEO's supposedly decorative wife. "Over the next 2 weeks," I continued, addressing the broader group again, "Meridian's transition team will work directly with each of your departments to integrate operations, technology, and client services. Thomas has generously agreed to remain during this period to ensure continuity for key institutional relationships." All eyes shifted to Thomas, who nodded confirmation. "I believe this acquisition represents the best possible outcome for our clients, our employees, and our shareholders. Meridian brings proven technology and fresh capital at a moment when Reynolds Financial has neither." The humility in this statement, the forthright acknowledgement of failure without excuses or deflection, surprised me. It was a side of Thomas I'd rarely seen during our marriage. "You've all worked extraordinarily hard to build this company," he continued, his gaze moving around the table to each executive. "The current situation reflects failures of vision and leadership. My failures, not your dedication or capabilities." The room was utterly silent now, the senior team clearly stunned by this unprecedented display of accountability from a man who had typically blamed external factors or subordinates when initiatives failed. "I expect each of you to provide your full cooperation to Ms. Hammond and the Meridian team during this transition," Thomas concluded. "They represent the future of what we've built together." With that, he stepped back, physically and symbolically, ceding the floor to me. I outlined the transition schedule, introduced the Meridian team members who would lead each integration workstream, and addressed questions about operational priorities and client communications. Throughout this discussion, I watched Thomas watching me, his expression thoughtful, perhaps even admiring, as I navigated complex questions with the expertise he had never acknowledged I possessed. As the meeting concluded and executives began filing out, some shell-shocked, others already engaging enthusiastically with their Meridian counterparts, Thomas approached me. "You're very good at this," he said quietly. "Leading through crisis, maintaining focus on practical next steps rather than dwelling on how we got here." "I've had practice," I replied. "Building Meridian required navigating many critical moments, though none quite as public as this one." He nodded, acknowledging the years of experience he'd never bothered to inquire about. The transition team seems impressively prepared. We've been developing contingency plans for some time, I acknowledged. Not specifically targeting Reynolds, financial, but preparing for strategic acquisition opportunities generally. Of course, he said, though something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced this acquisition hadn't been specifically targeted all along. An awkward silence fell between us, the personal implications of this professional situation suddenly impossible to ignore in this momentary lull. "We should talk," he said finally. "Not here, not now, but soon. About everything." "Yes," I agreed. "We should." He hesitated, then added, "I'll be at the office late tonight. There are key clients I need to contact personally. But tomorrow, perhaps." "Tomorrow," I confirmed. "Dinner at home? 7 o'clock?" "I'll be there," he promised, then turned. To go. Duty calling in the form of anxious institutional clients requiring reassurance from the man they'd trusted with their investments. I watched him walk away, straight-backed and dignified despite the professional catastrophe unfolding around him. For all his flaws, the dismissiveness, the condescension, the inability to see me clearly, Thomas Reynolds was facing failure, with more grace than I might have expected. The remainder of the day passed in a whirlwind of activity. Integration meetings, client communications, regulatory filings, and management briefings. By late afternoon, the initial market panic had stabilized somewhat, with Reynolds Financial's stock price settling at approximately 30% below its previous value. Significant damage, but not the complete collapse that might have occurred without. Meridian's immediate intervention. I returned to Meridian's offices for a final executive meeting before heading home. Elaine had assembled our leadership team to review day one progress and adjust our approach for the coming days. "Client retention is tracking above projections," she reported. 97% of contacted accounts have confirmed they'll remain through the transition, largely due to the retention of their primary advisors. "And staff morale?" I asked. "Mixed but trending positive," Jessica replied. "Initial shock is giving way to cautious optimism as they learn more about Meridian's performance and culture. Having Diana Chen publicly endorse our quantitative models has helped considerably with the technical teams." "The media narrative is still split," Martin added. "Business outlets are focusing on the technology failure and acquisition strategy. Popular press is fixated on the personal angle, the wife secretly building a company that acquires her husband's failing firm." "That was inevitable," I acknowledged. "We'll continue providing only business-focused statements and decline all interview requests that lean toward personal drama. This is a financial story, not a domestic one." As the meeting concluded and the team dispersed, Elaine remained behind, her expression thoughtful. "You've achieved everything you set out to do," she observed. "Meridian has acquired a significant client base and established brand presence. Our quantitative models will soon demonstrate their superiority in the marketplace. And the financial community that once dismissed you as just Thomas Reynolds' wife now recognizes you as a formidable financial strategist." "Yes," I agreed, though without the satisfaction she might have expected. "Yet you seem pensive," she noted. "Not quite the triumphant moment you anticipated?" I moved to the window, looking out over the Boston skyline as twilight descended. I built Meridian because I wasn't permitted to contribute meaningfully elsewhere, not because I wanted to prove something or exact some form of revenge. The acquisition was a sound business decision, not a personal vendetta. "And yet it's impossible to separate the personal from the professional in this case," Elaine observed, "especially given the conversation you'll have with Thomas tomorrow." I turned, to face her, surprised. "How did you know about that?" She smiled slightly. "I've been your second in command for 5 years, Olivia. I notice things." Indeed she did, one of the many reasons Meridian had succeeded under our joint leadership. "What will you say to him?" she asked. It was the question I'd been avoiding, All day, focusing instead on the operational details of the acquisition rather than its implications for my marriage. I don't know, I admitted. For years, I built a company he never knew existed, while he dismissed my capabilities without a second thought. That's not a foundation for a healthy partnership. And yet, Elaine said carefully, he's handled today with remarkable grace. No public recriminations, no attempts to undermine the acquisition, full cooperation with the transition process. That suggests a capacity for growth that might be worth considering. I sighed, recognizing the truth in her observation. Perhaps, but 5 years of dismissal and condescension can't be erased by one day of gracious defeat. Of course not, she agreed, but sometimes crisis reveals character in unexpected ways. The Thomas Reynolds I observed today was not the arrogant, dismissive man you've described from your marriage. No, I conceded. He wasn't. Elaine gathered her things, preparing to leave. Whatever you decide, Olivia, remember that you're negotiating from a position of acknowledged strength now, not from the shadows. That changes everything. After she left, I remained at the window, watching as lights came on across the city. Somewhere in one of those buildings, Thomas was making difficult calls to clients he'd spent years cultivating, explaining the situation and introducing Meridian as their new investment manager. It couldn't be easy, yet by all accounts, he was, handling it with professionalism and transparency. My phone buzzed with a text message from Rachel Cooper. Congratulations on the acquisition announcement. The financial community is impressed with the smooth handling. Dinner soon to celebrate properly? I smiled at her supportive message, grateful for her early recognition and quiet assistance during Meridian's development. Rachel had seen my capabilities when Thomas couldn't or wouldn't, had treated me as a peer rather than an accessory. Absolutely, I replied. Though there are some personal matters to resolve first. Her response came quickly. Of course. Daniel says Thomas is being surprisingly constructive with institutional clients today. People can surprise you sometimes. Indeed, they could. The question was whether Thomas's constructive approach represented a genuine evolution in how he saw me, and us, or merely pragmatic adaptation to changed circumstances. I left the office as darkness settled over Boston, the city lights creating a constellation of professional and personal lives intersecting in countless ways. For 5 years, I had maintained a strict separation between Olivia Reynolds and O.P. Hammond, between the underestimated wife and the respected financial innovator. Now those identities had converged, creating a new reality I was still learning to navigate. The house was dark when I arrived home, Thomas still at the office handling client concerns as expected. I moved through the rooms, switching on lamps, the familiar space suddenly feeling different. Neither the showplace of a successful financial couple, nor the secret base of operations for my parallel career, but something not yet defined. In Thomas's study, financial reports and documents were scattered across his desk, the detritus of desperate last-minute attempts to save his company. I gathered them neatly, creating order from chaos, a small act of consideration despite the complicated emotions swirling beneath the surface. As I straightened the papers, a photograph caught my attention. Thomas and me at the Financial Innovation Conference where we first met, both of us laughing at something now long forgotten. I'd been a rising star at Goldman Sachs then, my quantitative models already generating significant returns for elite clients. He'd been impressed by my intelligence then, had sought my insights, and valued my perspective. When had that changed? When had admiration transformed into dismissal, partnership, into hierarchical certainty about our respective roles? The shift had been so gradual I'd barely noticed it happening until it was complete, until I found myself being introduced as Thomas's wife, rather than by name or professional accomplishment, until my financial observations were met with indulgent smiles rather than genuine consideration. I replaced the photograph on his desk, a reminder of what had been and what might have been, and perhaps a question about what still might be, if circumstances aligned differently now. My phone rang, Thomas's number appearing on the screen. "Hello? Olivia." His voice sounded tired but composed. "I've finished with the client calls for tonight. The response has been better than expected. Most are willing to give Meridian a chance, especially after reviewing your performance metrics." "That's good news," I replied. "The transition team reports similar positive responses across other client segments." "I'll be home in about an hour," he continued. "I know we plan to talk tomorrow, but would you mind if we spoke briefly tonight? Nothing extensive, just I have something I need to say that shouldn't wait." I hesitated, uncertain whether either of us had the emotional energy for a significant conversation after such an eventful day. "Of course," I said finally. "I'll be here." After we disconnected, I moved to the kitchen, preparing a simple meal. Nothing elaborate, but something substantive after what had likely been a day of missed meals for both of us. The familiar routine of chopping vegetables and searing protein provided a welcome counterpoint to the day's intensity, a reminder that life continued beyond professional upheaval. I heard Thomas's car in the driveway just as I was plating the food. Moments later, the front door opened and closed quietly. "Olivia?" he called, his voice revealing surprise that I might be in the kitchen rather than my study. "In here," I replied. He appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened and jacket removed, exhaustion evident in the shadows beneath his eyes. He paused, taking in the prepared meal with visible surprise. "You cooked," he observed unnecessarily. "I thought you might be hungry," I said simply. "It's been a long day." Something shifted in his expression, a softening, perhaps even gratitude for this small consideration amid circumstances where I might justifiably have offered none. "Thank you," he said quietly, moving to the table as I set down the plates. "That was thoughtful." We ate in silence for several minutes, the day's events hanging between us unacknowledged. Finally, Thomas set down his fork and looked directly at me. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice steady despite the obvious difficulty of this admission. "Not just for my reaction to learning about Meridian, but for years of dismissing your financial acumen, belittling your insights, and treating you as an accessory rather than a partner." I set down my own fork, surprised by the directness of his statement. "Thank you for saying that. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," he continued, "about how you tried to engage with me on financial matters, only to be consistently dismissed. I've been reviewing those moments in my mind, and I'm ashamed of how I behaved." His candor was unexpected. Thomas Reynolds acknowledging fault without qualification or deflection. "What changed?" I asked. "You've never been particularly introspective about our relationship." He considered this question carefully before responding. "Today, I watched the financial community that once dismissed you as just my wife suddenly recognize you as a brilliant strategist and quantitative innovator. I watched my own executive team, people who've known you for years, realize they had completely misjudged your capabilities." He paused, meeting my gaze directly. "And I realized I had done exactly the same thing, but worse, because they were merely following my lead. I established the pattern of dismissing your insights, and everyone else followed suit." It was a remarkable acknowledgement, not just of the behavior itself, but of his responsibility for creating the environment that enabled it. "Why did you do it?" I asked, the question that had haunted me for years. "When we met, you respected my intelligence, valued my perspective. What changed?" Thomas looked down at his plate, considering his response. "It was gradual," he admitted. "At first, I was proud to have such an accomplished wife. But as Reynolds' Financial grew, as my public profile increased, I think I began to believe my own mythology. Mythology? I prompted. The narrative of the visionary leader whose insights transcended conventional wisdom, he explained. The financial press created that image, and I embraced it. And once I accepted that role, anyone who questioned my strategies, including you, became a threat to that carefully constructed identity. It was a startlingly honest assessment of dynamics I had observed, but never expected him to acknowledge. So you dismissed me to protect your self-image, I summarized. Yes, he admitted. It was easier to categorize you as just my wife than to engage with challenging perspectives that might have exposed flaws in my thinking. He gave a bitter laugh. Flaws that ultimately doomed the company anyway. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of these revelations settling between us. What happens now, Olivia? He asked finally. With Reynolds Financial's transition underway, with my professional future uncertain, with your identity as O.P. Hammond now public knowledge. Where does that leave us? It was the question I'd been turning over in my mind all day without reaching any clear conclusion. I don't know, I admitted. 5 years of building separate lives under the same roof isn't easily resolved in a single conversation. No, he agreed. It isn't. He hesitated, then added, but I hope we can find a way forward that acknowledges 2 things: my genuine regret for how I've treated you, and your extraordinary achievement in building Meridian while faced with constant dismissal. His words revealed a capacity for growth I hadn't been certain he possessed, an ability to recognize his failures without excuses or deflection. The transition period is 2 weeks, I noted. Perhaps we use that time to transition personally as well, to see if there's something worth rebuilding, or if we're better following separate paths. Thomas nodded slowly. A fair approach, he acknowledged. Professional collaboration by day, personal conversation by night, with no predetermined outcome. Exactly, I agreed. We evaluate honestly whether there's a foundation for a genuine partnership, one based on mutual respect rather than prescribed roles. I'd like that opportunity, he said quietly, though I recognize I haven't earned your trust or confidence and may never fully regain it. It was, perhaps, the most self-aware statement I'd ever heard from Thomas Reynolds, an acknowledgement of damage done without presumption of forgiveness. As we finished our meal in a silence more contemplative than awkward, I considered the path that had brought us to this extraordinary juncture. 5 years ago, I had begun building Meridian partly out of necessity, needing a professional outlet for capabilities that were being systematically dismissed, and partly out of determination to prove my worth, if only to myself. I had never anticipated that the company I built in the shadows would eventually emerge into the light to acquire the very firm whose founder had dismissed me as financially irrelevant. Nor had I expected that this professional reversal might create space for personal reassessment and potential reconciliation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: integration meetings, client transitions, media inquiries, regulatory filings. The business of merging 2 financial firms would demand full attention and clear focus. But tonight had opened a different kind of possibility. Not the triumph of revenge or vindication I might once have imagined, but something potentially more valuable. The recognition that sometimes crisis reveals character in unexpected ways, and sometimes the person who dismisses your value most persistently may also be capable of recognizing their error most profoundly when confronted with undeniable evidence of their misjudgment. Whether that recognition could form the foundation for a renewed relationship remained to be seen. But for the first time in years, the possibility existed, not as wishful thinking, but as a question worth exploring with clear eyes and cautious optimism. As Thomas helped clear the table, a small gesture he'd rarely offered before, I found myself recalling my grandmother's advice when I'd graduated from Harvard. Your greatest asset isn't your intelligence, Olivia, though that's considerable. It's your capacity to reassess and adapt when circumstances change. Perhaps Thomas was demonstrating that same capacity now. And perhaps I needed to as well. To consider that the man who had dismissed me as just a wife might be capable of becoming the partner I had once believed he could be. Time would tell. And for once, time was on my side. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.